Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am Shogun, and joining me today is Jigmo for episode 5 of Philosophy with Jigmo. Last episode we talked about animal rights, and today we will discuss environmental issues. Before we get started, though, please do follow and subscribe on both YouTube and BitChute, where you can find over 200 episodes of the Roundtable Podcast. And also find us now on Podbean, where you can find all our podcasts as well. Most of all, though, please join the Roundtable Discord server, where we record this podcast every day at 8 p.m. Central, and where you can find links to all of our other social media. So, Jigmo, welcome again. Thank you for joining me. How are you, my friend?
I'm excellent. How are you?
Honestly, fantastic. Having a watermelon beer, hanging out with my cat. It is Friday. It is payday. I just finished work and I have tomorrow off. And we're doing a philosophy with Jigmo. So, life is good. Thank you.
Yeah. Perfect.
So, sorry, that was a long answer. But today we had a paper, which was a reading that was going to be available and was available for anyone who wanted to read it as a preparation for today's episode. But we also know that people are busy and we don't necessarily expect people to do that. So either way, we're going to get into it. But for those who didn't read the paper, could you maybe give at least an introductory summary of what it's about?
Absolutely. Last time we talked, Shogun, we discussed something, the topic of animal rights or animal liberationism in the face of Peter Singer. This is a man called Sober writing against another view, which is called environmentalism. A very important distinction between environmentalism and any sort of animal rights and animal liberationism. And the distinction is this: the animal rights person or the animal liberationist wants to focus on the suffering, the experience of animals. Right? They want to talk about the moral value that is present there in the suffering of animals, the individual animals. The environmentalist wants to focus on groups. They want to focus on species. And they attribute a value to species that is not reducible to the value of the individual members or to the instrumental value of the species to other species or to us. They want to say that species as standalone entities have special value. So to formulate the environmentalist view, if there was like a blue whale and a sperm whale, and the sperm whale was really rare and the blue whale wasn't, the environmentalist would always pick the sperm whale over the blue whale survival-wise. And on certain environmentalist views, they would actually take one sperm whale over 2 blue whales, which is a very fascinating view. It's called environmentalism. And so Sober presents a bunch of arguments against the view and finally tries to help it out at the very end of the paper. And I'm not sure how you want to do this. I have a full presentation where I give all the arguments that Sober gives, and I could rephrase them or talk about them in great detail. Or we could have a more of a back and forth about this. However you want to do it, I'm comfortable with either. That is the general topic of the paper, though.
Thank you. So, because you prepared a presentation and because that you are the one who has the content here, I think rather than the interview format we often use, we'll use the presentation format. So I will just ask you to go through whatever you think is appropriate to go over. And after you complete that, we will openly discuss it, or actually we'll have a question and answer period first.
Sure. Let's get into the very first argument Sober discusses. It's called the ignorance argument. So this is an argument environmentalists often pose to justify their view of species being inherently valuable. Species may have some unknown value to us as human beings. For example, penicillin. Who thought it would be more important than just something that we used to make cheese? It's an incredible part of our medicine or our medicinal life. And what the environmentalist wants to say is, listen, we don't know what value species might have to us in the future, therefore we should preserve every single species. Sober thinks this is a bad argument for 2 reasons. Number 1, uncertainty goes both ways. There's a possibility that any given species can provide something good and incredibly useful to the world. There's also a possibility that it can provide something incredibly damaging and harmful. And the general lesson there is that when you apply arguments from uncertainty, you have to swing the uncertainty in all the directions available to you. You cannot only swing it into one direction. Second reason, we do somewhat risky things all the time. So if the reason we're not getting rid of a single species is because we might miss out on some life-saving opportunity that will produce a positive effect that will save us from chaos, then we're acting somewhat irrationally compared to our other actions. For example, we all take airplanes. If we took trains instead, maybe we would save ourselves some, seemingly negligible chance of dying. But we don't care about that seemingly negligible chance. We take the airplane anyway to save ourselves 2-3 hours of travel time. We sometimes go on the highway instead of regular roads. We take on minor risks all the time to live life in a more convenient way, and we don't consider that to be irrational. So he thinks that insofar as you can apply that reasoning to this, it is not irrational to kill off species that have some seemingly negligible or small chance of providing some enormous benefit or helping us avoid catastrophe. That's the ignorance argument and the two objections to it. The second argument that environmentalists like to use is the slip. And by the way, Shogun, stop me at any time if you want me to elaborate on any of the arguments or any of the counter arguments, and definitely feel free to ask questions. Slippery slope argument. We know of this one. I mean, whenever we talk about free speech, First Amendment rights, we talk about this idea of, if you ban one word, you're going to ban a second word, a third word, and a fourth word, and soon you'll have no words left to use. And the environmentalist often wants to say, well, listen, if you kill off one species and two species and three species, you're going to be on your way to killing off many species. Sober thinks this is also a very limited argument for the following reason. Let's say you have 10 million species. You kill off one, kill off a second, you kill off a third. Well, there's a sense in which every single time you kill off a species, the species which are remaining become more valuable. So if you have 10 million baseball cards and you start burning one, a second one, a third one, the remaining ones remain valuable in some sense. So that is one consideration against that argument. Another consideration, there's a matter of diminishing value here. A world that has 50 billion species is not that much more valuable than a world which has 49 billion species. If you think it does, then you probably think that adding species does not have a diminishing value as you get into the very high numbers, which is a rather strange view. He thinks that there is a diminishing value system there, and it's incoherent to ask for like millions and millions of species. It's okay if you lose some here and there, or a few thousand here and there, given how many are available now. And he also thinks that it's incumbent on the environmentalists to say that we are in a place of grave danger when it comes to a reduction in diversity. So let's say that the environmentalist really cares about total diversity. They want to say, listen, we got to have X amount of species. Well, it's incumbent on them to show that the X is the number that we're approaching now as we're reducing. And he says that's an empirical matter that, quite frankly, is likely not going to get solved. There's an enormous burden of proof here on the environmentalists to make this version of the argument work. Probably not going to. But that's an empirical challenge he leaves alone, which I think is very respectable of him. Third argument, appeal to what is natural. And this has got to be my favorite. Here's an important note. Environmentalists don't care about domestic chickens. They care about things in the wild, care about quote-unquote natural things. They don't care about domestic or quote-unquote man-made or man-affected beings or entities. So there's a distinction being made here, and it's a distinction between the natural or the wild and the artificial or the man-made. And the claim is, listen, one has a special sort of call to value. Here's the question Sober asks, we humans, are we part of nature? Okay, if the answer is yes, then the things we do are also part of nature. Apes are part of nature, higher apes anyway. They create structures, they affect their environments. What do we? How much different is what we do to chickens from symbiotic and parasitic relationships prevalent all throughout nature? Not that different in a morally relevant way. If you answer no to the question of whether humans are natural, you are cornering yourself into a very fascinating place, because you have to give a principled reason for why it is that human beings are not part of nature, which is really hard to do. And Sober says, listen, that's not really a line of thinking that I think you can make work. I think humans are plausibly part of nature in any morally relevant sense of the term. And another thing he mentions, and I think this is very, very clever, it's important to say, extinction is natural. On any definition of natural, extinction and death is natural. Evolution, as we understand it, is quite literally the making of new genetic categories and their destruction in a way, and they're not the fittest around. So if there's anything that is natural in the way that the environmentalist cares about, it's probably death and extinction. And another thing that's really important is to note that suffering and misery are commonplace in nature. In fact, what he points out, and I think he quotes Darwin extensively throughout the paper, is that suffering and death are the currency of evolution. It is the way things happen. That's the way things are bought and sold. And I think that's rather plausible. Another argument, trees and plants have desires. Just give me 5 seconds. So the argument is the trees and plants have desires. This argument is very fascinating. Any response. So the argument goes something like this. We must water plants. They need sunlight. There's some sense in which plants and trees have desires. They have needs. They have desire and needs, these things. And what Sober says is, well, listen, you have this view of desires and needs, which no longer requires a mind. You're basically saying that anything which has survival conditions which must be met for it to survive, now has needs and desires which are morally relevant. And he points out, quite cleverly, conditions which are necessary for its survival. Watches, banking firms, concrete buildings. If what grounds something having needs or desires is, you need to meet criteria XYZ for it to continue persisting or continue living or whatever, then lo and behold, nearly everything around you has survival conditions. And if you loosen desire and need that way, nearly everything around you has morally relevant needs and desires. So at that point, you can't give a good argument as to why to destroy a bridge and not to destroy a tree. Even bridges need to be taken care of in some way. 7. This is now getting into the more radical environmentalist views. So the environmentalist is directly opposed to something called the reductive utilitarian. The reductive utilitarian says that the only entities that have values are individual beings and traits about the individual being. So the only things that matter are the suffering and the happiness and the experience and the desire of individual beings. This is kind of your basic utilitarianism. The environmentalist wants to say is, listen, there are entities which are above those things, above the individual, which matter. There's a certain radical sort of environmentalist that wants to say, not only is it that both individuals and meta-entities or groups matter, only groups matter. But this sort of radical environmentalist would say, listen, individual members don't have value. They only have value as a part of a group. And Sober's response to this is listen, if you have this view, then quite frankly, you could make a scenario in which a mosquito, because of its rarity to a certain ecological locale, would have more value than a human being trying to survive in that locale. He basically says, if your ethical view makes it so that you would take a mosquito over a human being, not because the mosquito will save other human lives, but just because it provides some diversity metric, your ethical view is blatantly wrong. And here's a lesson in meta ethics that we touched on the last time, and I think this was fascinating. When we're doing ethics or any sort of moral study, we have sort of foundational principle judgments which are undeniable. And if you're engaging with somebody who is denying those foundational, meaningful judgments that are more meaningful and foundational than anything else, then you're really talking past each other. So what he says is, listen, this radical environmentalist, he can posit this all he wants, but if he's willing to accept this conclusion that a mosquito is more valuable than a human being, well, we're not really talking the same language anymore. They are in their own world. And I totally agree with him. And finally, he points out the problem of demarcation. Demarcation is distinction. So the example is, what separates a mountain and a bridge? Why would it be that a mountain is morally relevant, but a bridge isn't? They're made of rock. Both have certain shapes, certain characters, certain properties. Why on earth would it be that a bridge is not as morally relevant as a mountain is, or a set of mountains is more important than a set of bridges? And he offers a possible explanation. One answer environmentalists often give is, well, the bridges are made by human beings and the mountains aren't. The bridges are shaped by agents and the mountains aren't. See, that argument seems to work, but then you realize most of nature, most of the natural environment is heavily affected by the agents which live in it. No forest remains unaffected by the non-human agents which inhabit it. So if your criteria for meaningful is unaffected or undesigned or unmoved by agents, well, then nearly none of nature is meaningful. Some other environmentalists say that only a certain type of agential influence matters. So if it's a conscious agent affecting the environment, it doesn't matter. But if it's like a non-conscious or non-cognitively capable agent affecting the environment, it does matter. The idea would be that if like ants and like basic animals affect the forest, it matters. Cognitively complex beings like humans affect a town or a city. The town or city doesn't matter. And he says it's a crazy view. It's crazy to say that the more cognitivity and consciousness you have in the design of a thing, the more its value goes down, the lesser its value is. He says that's just a ridiculous view. And as you noted, we kind of moved from a point of slippery slope and ignorance to pointing to the natural, and we kind of got into the more ridiculous ones at the end with what was that one called? The trees have desires, and meta value matters only, and trying to demarcate a bridge in a mountain. But then, and Sober is a really nice guy. I think Sober is a really brilliant, nice guy. He gives an interesting possible avenue for environmentalists to assign value to nature. And I think this is absolutely brilliant. I'm really excited about this. I hope this makes sense. What follows is very important. We are concerned about art in a very specific way. Okay? You going to and seeing the Mona Lisa personally is different from you seeing the Mona Lisa in a picture or in a sort of Nozikian experience machine that we talked about the very first time we met Shogun. This experience machine where you sit in this thing and you're dreaming up a reality that's not really a reality. It is plausible to argue that having that real-blooded experience of the real Mona Lisa in front of you has a value that is not reducible to the experience. It's not reducible to some instrumental value. That Mona Lisa is really sitting there. It's really before you. It's rare. It's unique. It's individual. And he proposes through a man called, I think, Rutledge, maybe saying that name wrong. He proposes that maybe nature has aesthetic value very similar to art. For example, in art, there's this idea that if a painter has less and less paintings, or if their paintings are being lost, or if they're currently dead and they cannot paint anymore, then the paintings that are left are more valuable, which is very similar to the sort of view that the environmentalist wants to have about the animals left in a species. So there's certain similarities, and what he offers by the end is maybe there is a coherent comparison to be made between the way we value art in an aesthetic way and the way we value nature. He ultimately says this is surely not enough to the environmentalist what he wants. This is why he says so. Let's say that you are the last man remaining on Earth, the very last man, and you have before you this enormous ecological entity, this enormous forest, and you have on the other side this enormous museum filled with some of the greatest art available to mankind. And as you are about to pass away, you get to choose to destroy either one or the other. Let's say the environmentalist can make the argument that destroying the museum is of the same importance, or it's of the same gravity or greater gravity, lesser gravity, than nature is. The worst case scenario, they will get the conclusion that the museum is more important. In a kind of a mediary scenario, they'll get the conclusion that the museum and the forest are equally important. And in the best case scenario, they will say that the forest is more important than the museum. But they cannot deny that the museum has real aesthetic value in the same way nature has. At this point, he's assumed that aesthetic value is really all the environmentalist is going to get, which I kind of agree with. He says in the end, even if we grant aesthetic value, notice how aesthetic value is very limited. Because what the environmentalist wants is a very relevant, powerful moral value. Aesthetic value is a sort of value we care about after other basic human needs are met. Aesthetic value is something we care about when we've dealt with hunger and when we've dealt with thirst and with shelter and with all this stuff. And if what the environmentalist wants us to do is to environmentalist gets is that nature has more aesthetic value than human-made stuff, and that's fine. What they're likely not going to get is that only nature has aesthetic value, because it shares a lot of the same properties as art does. In fact, this is what's driving this. Yes, you have lost all claim to moral value, or most claim to moral value, but maybe we can make some sense of this being comparable to art. So at best, the environmentalist is going to get to say, listen, nature is better than art, and that's fine. Notice the aesthetic value is not the sort of thing that we let people go hungry for, or let people not have shelters for, or cram people into small spaces for. And if what the environmentalist wants us to do is to give up some of our food, or to give up some of our shelter, or to not expand in some way because of aesthetic value, well, that's just not the reasonable thing to do. It's going to take really heavyweight argumentation to produce an argument. Really heavyweight argumentation. It's going to take really heavyweight argumentation to get to the conclusion that aesthetic value is going to be more fundamental or be more important than moral value. It's generally not the view. So to sum up, all in all, we went through the ignorance argument, went through the slippery slope argument, we went to the argument from the category of the natural, we went through the argument of natural entities having desires and the the crazier only macro stuff has value. We also went through the demarcation problem as related to this set of entities. And finally, we granted the environmentalists some stuff with the aesthetic comparison, but I think the conclusion is this is nowhere near enough what the environmentalist wants. And I think that sums up most of the points Saber makes. I still highly recommend reading the paper to anybody. It's an absolutely excellent paper, and I've left quite a bit of stuff out. It's only 20 pages, but there's so much. But that's my presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Again, everyone make sure you check out all of Jigmo's episodes on Aristotle and all different topics. So we're going to open it up for audience questions and participation now, but I also have a set of core questions I want to ask you, but we want to give the audience a chance here. Does anyone have a question for Jigmo or a comment?
I do. Okay.
Oh,
okay. Go ahead, Charlie.
No, it's fine. Go on, Simon.
Mine was pretty quick. Going back to the category or how we define nature, and so if man, so I'm just curious. So if man is natural, as you propose, how would you define that which is artificial?
Well, I think the argument Sober wants to make is that the natural artificial distinction is vacuous. So if what you mean by artificial is produced by natural entities, well then, any sort of tools that an anthill, for example, would be artificial. You could say that. I mean, you could make that artificial natural distinction, but it is in no way morally or scientifically relevant. Here's another thing he brings up. I kind of forgot to mention this. Ever since Darwin, we have not thought of natural as some teleological, ontologically thick thing like Aristotle held to. We think of it statistically. Natural is just that which is the most statistically prevalent. It is the thing which nature functions in a way where individual organisms want to maximize their chances of survival, and all that happens is that over time in nature, certain genes become more statistically prevalent than others. It's quite literally the only driving force of anything that is considered. And so one of the things that Sober points out is there really isn't much of a value Latin naturality. There isn't much space for that in modern science. It's really just a relic of the past that careless people use in modern arguments sometimes. So the response would be the distinction really has no real purpose or value. Do you find that answer satisfactory? What do you think?
Yeah.
You agree with him?
You cleared it up a little bit, so yeah, thanks for that.
I have a question, Jigmo.
Sure.
How do you demarcate the value between current food, shelter, water needs and potential future food, shelter, water needs in terms of the environment potentially providing that, should it be sustained?
Oh man, that's a big question, and this is exactly why Sober says at the beginning, the environmentalist is trying to get to something that is more than instrumental value. So what you're asking me is, nature as of now has instrumental for us in the present and instrumental value for us in the future. And there's some sense in which that if we can trade the former for the latter. We can take more now, or we can take more later. And that question of how do we measure actual value or present value versus potential value or future value is so much more complicated than I wish it was. That would require probably a 3-hour talk on its own. Me doing quite a bit of research. So what I'll say for now is fascinating question. Quite what Sober is shooting for, but really important one for us to analyze the role of the environment in our survival properly. I'm going to leave that one hanging and just say it's an excellent question. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Can I go for a second here?
Sure.
So first of all, Jigmo, that was a really good monologue. I really enjoyed that, but I had few problems with that, but you covered so many topics, so I'm just going to focus. The most important thing that interests me was the topic about moral value and aesthetic value. I don't think that I just can't align with that idea. How do you measure aesthetic value or moral value? I don't think you can do that.
I don't think he's interested in quantifying or measuring aesthetic or moral value. Here are the following presuppositions that he makes in the paper. One, there is some sort of evaluative or moral value that is relevant to our decision making. Environmentalist wants to get some of this moral or evaluative value to attach to groups, special groups. He believes such arguments fail. He doesn't resort to some sort of moral nihilism or moral skepticism to do so. He grants that there is moral values to be given. He just believes that the environmentalist fails at doing so. At the end of the paper, he proposes an analogy to art, and he proposes that nature and our relation to it is very similar to our relation to art. And insofar as art is said to have aesthetic value, maybe nature does too. But on any conception of aesthetic value and moral or evaluative value, whether you are a subjectivist or a constructivist or a nihilist, aesthetic value, regardless of how you put it, generally comes after moral value, not before. Do you find any of those claims troublesome?
Not really. I suppose I can see that finding a value in these topics is subjective, I suppose. But let me just shoehorn just one more question. I'm a kind of new guy here, so maybe I'm an oddball out. But I suppose you guys also, you're advocates of animal cruelty. You're maybe vegans or something like that. Am I right or wrong?
Did you just say we're advocates of animal cruelty?
Well, and I was stupid against animal cruelty, of course.
Right.
Yes. So,
Chris is one who proposes, speaks for, or defends something. So no, we're not advocates of animal cruelty. Yeah, opponents, I am, yes, but Jigmo can answer.
So this server is filled to the brim with people with all sorts of views. I personally will answer this question because I am doing the podcast. I do not speak for the rest of the server. Last time Shogun and I talked, we talked about animal rights, or the rights for the suffering of animals to be considered our decision making. I think Shogun and I came to an agreement that the suffering of animals is important. We didn't get all the way down to how much this should affect our dietary choices, how much importance there is, but we agreed that there's some importance. We left off by saying that there's a lot of moral work to be done. This talk was meant to be a continuation of that talk, because at that talk we said, okay, great, we covered animals. Now let's talk about whether natural systems, trees, ecologies have value that is more than just the value of something suffering or instrumental value to humans. And I said, I'll try to look for something and do a podcast on it. And this was it. This was a man called Sober looking at environmentalism, this theory that special groups or ecological entities have a special value, and arguing against that view, in the end reconciling it in a kind of a mediary sort of way. I personally agree with Sober that ecological groups and species do not have special value, but I am a big fan of considering animal suffering to be important and an enormous part of our future moral decision making. I think it should be. It's my own view. Some people here agree with me, some people don't. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, right. Thank you. Thanks for the answers.
I have a question for Jigmo. So your stance is that ecological systems have no special value.
Well, cornering me with this tough question. It depends what you mean by special, right? So I believe ecological systems have instrumental value to human beings. I believe that if you get really loose as to what value is, then bridges and complicated constructions by human beings have the same sort of value. I believe the members of the ecological groups, the animals that suffer and that move around and have lives, they have value. But does the special group have some special value that differentiates it from human groups that isn't reducible to the members and that isn't instrumental? Exists. I think the only plausible candidate is some sort of total diversity metric, but there's a lot of empirical questions there that aren't answered by the environmentalist in the Sober paper. So my answer is a tentative no, given all those criteria, but I see room for them to move forward with an argument. It's just going to require more development on their part, on the environmentalist part. So tacit no.
So basically, you would rank animal specialty and human specialty over ecological, more natural types of entities. Yes?
Yeah. I personally, I don't want to commit very hard, because I think groups have some value. I'm leaning towards a dualism, which says not only do members have value, but groups have value too. But in a most strict and honest hour, I would say that I'm more focused on the members. I care more about the individual humans and the individual animals than societies or ecological locales or groups. Yeah, that would be my view.
Interesting.
Are you gonna hammer me with some knockout question, or was that?
No, it kind of doesn't make sense to me, because if you were to put one over the other, you would have to sort of have some type of belief that one didn't really come from the other, which is against a lot of evolutionary type of theories, which I thought you were aligned with.
So you might have a very fascinating objection in the air here. So what is the contradiction? Elaborate on that.
I guess the contradiction is that as far as the aesthetic purpose of natural systems and such, one that wasn't mentioned was its usefulness to people, not just so much animals, but consider like the Amazon or the jungles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
A lot of people out here in the West would be more likely to talk about how that's really messed up, all these fires that are happening and everything going on, damage to those types of systems, and putting value over them over than other human issues that we've been having lately. But if you were to consider like how those systems actually are very helpful to us, not just aesthetically, but, you know, providing things that is necessary for survival, like oxygen, those rivers in the sky, you know what I mean? All those stuff that supplies everything else and all other types of life. Do you kind of get what I'm getting at? Like, it's not... yeah.
So
the part of it isn't so important as the other part, and it should be considered. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I absolutely agree with you, and I just realized that was unclear. Instrumental value literally means what you're describing. So, insofar as I need the Amazonian, insofar as I need some set of forests to be able to breathe, the forests have enormous amounts of instrumental value to me. So when Sober says that the environmentalist wants to produce a claim to value other than over and above the instrumental, what he's saying is that everybody agrees these forests are important for our survival, for medicine, for the science's study of the nature of biological reality and chemical reality. He grants all that, but he says that there's a set of people, the environmentalists, who say the species, the ecological locale has some value over and above that instrumental value. So both Sober and I agree with you. These things have enormous amounts of instrumental value, far more important than the aesthetic value. But all he says is, beyond the instrumental value, the only value that could really be assigned is an aesthetic one. Does that make more sense?
No, yes, it does. I guess I wasn't so sure of the term instrumental value, but thank you.
Yeah, no, it's really my fault for not explaining it better. So, yeah.
So, does anyone else have a question for Jigmo? Well, okay. Nobody else has a question, because I have a few that I want to ask, but go ahead. Okay. So this is going to be like kind of a gross simplification after everything you've said and everything we've talked about. But I want to just ask you a series of simple questions to ascertain your position on this, if that's okay. So the first question is, do you believe that non-human life could potentially be of greater significance, morally speaking, than human life?
And by non-human, you don't only mean the stuff that is currently existent on this planet, but like some possible alien species goes into non-human.
For the purposes of this conversation, I would like to constrain it to the known biological life of planet Earth only. But my point is, right, do you believe there could be some non-human terrestrial life that is of greater value morally than humans? So to clarify what I mean, perhaps the largest redwood tree in the world is called Sequoia hempervirens, something like this. But it's like the biggest tree in the world, right? And it's taller than the Empire State Building. Its location is kept secret because it's such a valuable tree. They don't want it to get cut down. But it's the tallest tree in the world, right? So would that potentially be worth more morally than a human being? Or if there were, 100 white tigers left in the world, would one of them potentially actually have more value than a human? Or would a human always surpass animals and plants in value morally, in your opinion?
Yeah. And I take it what we're assuming for this case is that the tree or the tigers don't have some like instrumental value that tracks back to humans. So it's not like the tree is going to help cure cancer, or the tigers have some genetic feature that's going to make our lives way better. They're just standalone. We're assessing their just inherent value. Are we?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
To account for instrumental value, I'm assuming we're saying that the tree isn't going to help like cure cancer, and the tigers they don't have some gene that we're going to like use to make human life better. They're just standalone entities that we're measuring, right?
I understand. Okay, no. So that's not so much what I'm saying, not in the sense that you could get a cancer cure or something. I'm saying, if this tree is the last and only tree of its size in the entire planet Earth, generally speaking, things that are rare are considered precious, right? And things that are common are considered less precious. Now there's 9 billion, 8 billion people on the planet Earth, humans, lots of us. But there's only one tree, only one Sequoia sempervirens. So if that tree were cut down, something irreplaceable and unique would be lost from the world. But if, John Doe were hit by a car, well, he would be one of hundreds of thousands to be hit by a car or struck down today. And nobody will know his name, right? Nothing unique was, yes, he's unique, don't get me wrong. But is there a case to be made that certain forms of life, due to their rarity or perhaps their aesthetic value, something like this, are actually more value than people, humans, because of their abundance that they exist in, and sometimes lack of qualities? Do you see what I'm trying to ask?
Absolutely. To use the end of the sober paper, a similar question is: say we took the Mona Lisa and we said, "I'm going to either burn the Mona Lisa or kill this, seemingly average person, this just average person." Could an argument be made that you should not burn the Mona Lisa and kill the person instead? A very difficult question. What you're asking, in the sense, in my view, at that point is, can you have such an enormous amount of aesthetic value? Because we're talking about entities which are singular, or incredibly rare, incredibly important from just an aesthetic human experience point of view. And we're asking, can something have so much aesthetic value that it overrides the moral value of a human being? Number one, I think that the moral value of a human being is not infinite. It is finite. Insofar as moral value is finite, and there is some sense in which aesthetic value can relate to moral value, there is some enormous amount of aesthetic value that could maybe override moral value. There could be an argument that could be made that you should kill a person instead of cutting down the tree, or kill a person instead of burning down the Mona Lisa. But what I would point out at that point is to say that a skyscraper which is singular and which is as tall as the tree would, according to Sober, and I agree with him, be of the same value as the tree. So if you build an enormous, incredibly impressive metallic structure, which was of the same height and also was really rare, there's only one, that thing would have the same aesthetic value. So I'm saying two things. One, it is possible to make an argument that an overabundance of aesthetic value can override moral value. And two, this does not only apply to natural kinds, it also applies to human-made things as well. So is that a coherent response? Does that make sense to you? Kind of where I'm standing right now.
Yes, it is. It is a coherent response. However, I don't only mean aesthetic value. Aesthetic value is definitely part of it. And the Mona Lisa question is a pretty good analogy. But it's a little different because the Mona Lisa has no feelings. It has no flesh and blood. It doesn't suffer. It doesn't live. But like a Siberian white tiger is aesthetically spectacular. I would argue infinitely superior to the Mona Lisa. I would say, a Siberian white tiger is worth 1,000 Mona Lisas, right? Despite the value aesthetically of that painting, which I admit, because it's also a living thing. It is it's not just a work of art, it's a living work of art. And that tree, Sequoia sempervirens, in my opinion, although aesthetically and scientifically amazing, is also a living thing. So I guess what I'm getting at is it only humans that have inherent moral value, or the other forms of life have inherent moral value independent of their value to human beings? And if they do have their own moral value independent of their value to human beings, is it always inferior to that of human beings, or could it be superior, right? So if you had a dolphin, right, Jimmy the dolphin, well, they have no names, of course, but say it was Jimmy the dolphin versus Jimmy the human, and you have, I'm going to shoot one of these in the head, who do I spare? Could it be morally coherent to say shoot the human and save the dolphin, because the dolphin is actually perhaps more intelligent or more rare or has less sins against nature and other beings, so it's somehow more pure?
Yeah. So number one, I think animals can have inherent moral value. So the tiger in question and the dolphin in question would have inherent moral value. And then we're asking, we have a being with seemingly more moral value, but this thing has moral value plus enormous amounts of aesthetic value. I think that reduces to the same question. Can some overabundance of aesthetic value be more important than moral value? As I'm thinking about this, my head is thinking of cases where I should say no, because I'm imagining like last human, last tree, and I would definitely take the last human. But the point you made is that there are 7 billion human beings on this earth. There's an overabundance of humans, and that overabundance is leaning me towards preferring the tree, because I have this understanding of rarity that may be bordering on moral. I think there is something to rarity that is very important in some way, but I can't explain what that way is. I can't actually give you a set of moral criteria that makes that rarity important. If it's not reducible to helping human beings, if it's not conscious or suffering, which I'm assuming a tree isn't, as much as I want to say, yeah, this thing is great and we should take care of it and you love it and let it grow, I am hesitant to give it moral value. I'm leaning more towards giving it aesthetic value alone, and then we're back to the question of, can enormous amounts of aesthetic value overvalue moral value? And I'd have to think more about that. That's a very hard question. I haven't given enough thought to answer right now.
Isn't it really not really a fair question? Because morality and all those things, when you're assessing them, it comes from like a human. And you can ask another human how he feels about another human, and you probably get a response, but you can't really ask a tree how it feels about other trees, and it can't, you know what I mean? Like, it can't really give itself. You said if it comes down to a tree or a human, and there's only one tree and there's only one human, obviously you're going to pick the human because you're not a tree. But if you were a tree, you'd probably pick the tree. So
no, if I was a tree, I would still pick the human. And the reason I would pick the human is the human has moral value and aesthetic value at the point where it is the last one. It has that rarity value, which is kind of an aesthetic value, and the tree only has aesthetic value. So my point wasn't that I'm taking
from your human brain.
Well, no. Well, here you're assuming that we are moral constructivists and that we're just choosing a random language and moving forward, which is a fine assumption.
Hold on, guys. 1 second. Craig Bot dropped out again.
Oh.
Well, we're actually not using the Craig Bot recording at this point because we're going on text recording, so we might as well just continue.
So if you want to have a debate about the merits of moral realism, or moral cognitivism, I am more than willing to do that another time. I think I have some ammo I could unload, but that's a different topic. For now, let's assume that something like a moral realist picture is true. We have access to stuff that are the moral properties in a pretty objective and good access, reliable access most of the time, and we're comparing a tree and a human being. What I'm granting Shogun is, if there's many, many, many human beings, a single human being may have moral value, but it has no real aesthetic or rarity value, however you want to ground this. The tree does. And the question that emerges, if I'm understanding you properly, is, and some enormous amount of aesthetic value greater than some moral value? And right now I want to say no. I can see why somebody would say yes. I'd have to think more about it.
All right. So again, I want to open it up. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question at this interval? The question that I wanted to ask is just how you would assess this moral thought experiment. And I'll give you two possibilities. So you're the commander of the world and you the president of the planet Earth, and you get to two options. Plan A: we allow things to continue as usual, but our scientists have run the projections, and human activity will cause human extinction in 200 years. Everyone will die, because we'll produce too much waste and pollution, we'll harvest too many resources, we'll collapse the ecosystem, and everyone will die. But it won't happen for 200 years, but that's what will happen. Option 2 is we release a vaccine or any number of options, and we kill off 90% of the human population. We kill 90% of people, but our scientists estimate that if we do that, and only if we do that, the Earth can exist in perpetuity and maintain 10% of the current human population indefinitely. But if we maintain the current population as is now, we can go on for 200 years and then everyone will die. What would be the ethical thing to do?
Excellent question. I think Techno Sherman gave something of a similar question earlier. I rephrased it was, we have a certain amount of stuff that we can squeeze out of nature. We can squeeze it all out now in the near future, or we can kind of go slower and decrease our quality of life or decrease the number of people around in your version and go for longer. And the response I gave to Techno Shaman is this paper was concerned with post-instrumental value. So we're basically asking, how should we utilize nature in relation to ourselves and time? There is a man called Derek Parfit who does a whole set of things called population problems, where he measures this stuff out and he tries to give a perfect theory accounting for every single intuitive decision in regards to what we should do when it comes to population problems, of which your example is an example of which. So what I'm going to say for now is this is beyond my current expertise, what I'm prepared for right now. I don't have any expertise. What I'm prepared for right now. I am likely going to go forth and read Derek Parfit very carefully, and we'll probably do a podcast on population problems, which is the one you gave me in the future. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that is a satisfactory response. Now, does anybody else have any questions?
Can I add something to that? I'd like
Sure.
to point out a quote from Buckminster Fuller that points out, because it sort of creates a false conundrum in his view, because he views overpopulation as simply an engineering problem. We can engineer efficient systems and potentially sustain a world population of 10 billion.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating, and there's a bunch of empirical details here which will probably alter the way the stuff interacts with our actual world, right? I mean, it's fun to consider, well, if you have to choose between living as happy as you can for the next 200 years as a humanity, and then dwindling and dying away, or living a mediocre life for 2,000 years, which one should you take? These are fascinating questions, and there's usually a single dichotomy that you choose between. There's, of course, as you point out, an enormous amount of empirical nuance. There might be scientific advancements on the horizon that would completely change the way we should think about these cases. So, and I'm very unaware of all that stuff too. I have a lot of work to do. Whole field of population. Any other questions? Anybody else? Anything? It's okay if you've asked a question already. If you ask 2 or 3, it's no problem. Anything that comes to mind?
Well, let me just jump in. I posted something in the main chat about human's intrinsic value of life. I don't think there's a intrinsic value in the human life, the same way there's no intrinsic value in cow's life or bull's life or any other bovine or any other animal. I mean, it's all from a viewpoint of either human or the other part. What is bovine for us? It's food. It's just like a fuel. That's it, nothing else. I mean, maybe my point of view, my philosophical point of view, is like diametrically different from yours, but I'm just like trying to be pragmatic, I suppose. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I really hope I'm being pragmatic as well. I want to do the morally right thing, however. Here is an interesting thing to consider for you.
Sorry.
Please don't
let me
speak
respond.
once someone else is already speaking.
I'll let you respond. If all you have is extrinsic value, you really don't have any value at all. And I want to explain what I mean by that. When you say that you have some extrinsic value, I care about X because Y. Further question is, why do you care about Y? If all you have is extrinsic value, then Y is valuable for some other extra reason. And if you see where this is going, you say X is valuable, they ask you why. You say, well, because A, and then ask you why, and then you say B and C and D. And if all value is extrinsic, There's no fundamental ground floor level at which to ground value. We run for an infinity, an infinite set, an infinite passing on of the problem does not get you a solution. Or you just say it's arbitrary. I'm just choosing for this to matter. So when you say that you only see extrinsic value, I think in reality, if you're being honest, what you mean is either A, all value is arbitrary, or B, I'm just choosing not to address the problem with foundations. And
Yeah,
to
I
me,
think
that
he's trying to say that all value is fundamentally not intrinsic, I think is what he's trying to say by saying that humans don't have.
you mean arbitrary?
Yeah, arbitrary. Yeah.
Yeah, and my response is, if what you're saying is that all value is arbitrary, then you're really saying there's no value at all. I think plausibly value is like in my view anyway, it's like a physical object out there. So like if I said I see a chair over there, but that's just my opinion. I'm not really talking about a chair. I think values are a sort of extramental thing in the way many other things are extramental things. So the very idea of an arbitrary value is incoherent in my view. But that's me speaking from a realist point of view. And there's a lot of presuppositions here. There's a lot of assumptions. And if you want to have a full-fledged debate about metaethics or about the nature of value, I'd be more than willing to do it. I just, for now, let's assume some sort of moral realism is true to work with Sober's response to environmentalism. And we'll consider moral to do metaethics in the future very extensively. Just not now.
You're back.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry I had to mute there. I got a call from work, so I missed your response to my question, but that's the beauty of recording this. We can all listen to it again later. And, yeah. But if that concludes that, did anyone else have a question for Jigmo or a comment? And if not, I have one or two more I might like to ask.
What are we talking about?
Well, if you look at the title of the channel,
yeah. Sorry,
Jigmo, environment, and yeah, that's what we're talking about.
I don't want to reiterate the question that you answered, that I answered earlier, but I do want to say this. What I was saying was the techno-shaman had already asked your question, and what I offered was there's a whole set of questions which are very fascinating called population questions, or questions of like if X number of people survive or this number of people survive, or if they survive under these living conditions or those living conditions, which population should we choose? And the numbers vary and the quality of life varies, and there's this whole set of cases called population cases. And there was a man working in philosophy called Derek Parfit who wanted to look at all population cases and track the judgments we make in each and give a general theory X, which would explain all of our judgments. And so what I was saying was, and I think I should say this now because I think this is a good plan for the future, population cases are a very fascinating part of philosophy. I'm not very knowledgeable on them, which is why I can't fully answer your question or Techno-Shaman's question. But I plan to, moving forward, read Parfit very carefully and do a podcast or two on population cases because I think they're absolutely fascinating. So your question and Techno-Shaman's question will probably have to hold off till then. That I'm going to leave it at that.
All right, so this is a variation on my last question, which again I really regret that my work call I couldn't hear your answer to. I really wanted to hear it, but because so if you consider the ecosystem like an organism that can live or die, right, be in a state of living or death, you would have to say that if the planet itself were to die, that would be a moral conundrum or a moral significance that surpassed anything else, because it is by definition of the total of all moral value, right? Every living thing that we know of is part of the Earth ecosystem. And if the Earth ecosystem were to ultimately die, then everything that was part of it would die as well. So doesn't that kind of mean that any moral atrocity that you might call a moral atrocity would actually be justified if it would prevent the collapse of the system?
So I'll say this. I think if we're talking about what morally matters, what is morally valuable in an inherent way, what is important in a non-instrumental way, in the most important moral evaluative sense, it's not all organisms. Just because something is quote unquote an organism does not mean that it's morally valuable. I ground moral value in stuff like suffering, happiness, consciousness, dignity, family, either conscious properties or cognitive properties or properties which emerge out of conscious and cognitive properties. So if you have a planet which is just this enormous desert with just plants here and there and some insects, but really no cognitive stuff, no conscious stuff going on, to me, such a world has no moral value. Is my own view. Is a somewhat controversial view in certain circles, but I think it's an ultimately defensible view. Which is why earlier when we were talking about, the tree, and I think this is an extension of the same theme, to me, the tree has no inherent moral value. It has an enormous amount of aesthetic value. There's a certain rarity criteria, which is heavily fulfilled here. But if we're talking about moral value in the true, ultimate, fundamental sense, I am choosing to restrict, and not choosing, I think I can defend a view which restricts it to consciousness, cognitive capacities, and emergent stuff that arises out of those two, and everything else is instrumental to that or is valuable by some other criteria like aesthetic or rarity or what have you. And those values are not more fundamental or important than the moral values. That's my response. And so maybe to be more specific to your question, a planet dying without any conscious entities in it would be a morally bad thing. It would be a bad thing in some sense, but not in a moral sense. So if a planet dying is a bad thing in a moral sense, there must be some conscious entity in it. And the reason the planet dying is a bad thing is because of the conscious entity. If there is no conscious cognitive entity with these interesting emergent properties, then it's not moral. It's something else.
Okay, but this is an interesting question because to me it is pretty self-evident that animals and almost certainly plants are conscious, self-conscious, self-aware, right? Now, how you exactly determine sentience, I haven't studied to say appropriately, but I know like a tree has some self-consciousness, it has some self-awareness for sure. It just interprets in a different way. And in the same way animals do for sure, up to emotionality, planning, decision-making, anything you might kind of say. So I don't think we are humans like little islands of consciousness in an unconscious world. I think we are conscious beings in an ocean of consciousness, right? Everything from grass to Siberian tigers to fungus to eagles is also self-conscious, like it's self-aware. I have to be agnostic, I think we all do, about what the qualitative experience of those beings is, but it's absolutely higher than zero, and I'm not saying you think otherwise. But anything other than inorganic matter is self-aware and either suffering or euphoric, to some degree.
Yeah, I agree and disagree. I agree that animals are conscious, and a lot of them have, as we discussed before, an enormous amount of an enormous right to moral consideration, which is being denied and ignored. So I agree with the tiger and possibly the eagle and the pig and the cow and a bunch of other animals. But the moment you start saying that grass is conscious or self-aware, I'm going to start questioning what you mean by conscious or self-aware. And I'm going to bring up the Siberian line. You seem to be focused on the organic. I remember us discussing before that consciousness arises out of structures, and this was a view that you found appealing. I wonder how you can defend grass being conscious or fungi being conscious, but my chair not being conscious or a skyscraper not being conscious. I don't know. What is the...
So there's actually a lot of science that's been done and come out, which shows that plants are much more sophisticated than we would think, right? Which is understandable. Because when we walk by, we just see grass and it's green, doesn't do anything. So surely it's not aware of anything. But if you actually look at the people who've done the real science, these plants like exchange pheromone type things with each other and they signal to each other. And if one over there is going through stress, it signals to one over here that it needs to respond by emitting a different chemical. Because not now, but down the line, there's a goat that's eating me. He's going to be eating you. So you better go ahead and start emitting an acrid chemical so that when that goat eats you, it will not like the taste because I don't like getting eaten right now and I don't want it to happen to you. It's basically what it comes down to. And these trees and stuff, they're all connected under the ground with like networks of roots and so forth. And in some cases, they're all one giant organism. And in other cases, they communicate. So it's just like, it's sort of like we're biased to our organic animal form of life to the extent that we struggle to see plants as also alive. But if something eats them, they respond, right? And they respond because on some level they want to not be eaten, right? When they turn towards the sun, like a sunflower does, it's because they want the sun to shine on them, which means it's aware of this and it has a preference. It knows the sun is shining and it likes when it faces the sun. It doesn't like when it doesn't face the sun, which means it's aware of something, right? Now, we have to be agnostic about what that's like until we end up as sunflowers. But you can tell, right? The chair that you mentioned, if I put it in the sun, like I have my office chair right beside me and it rotates, right? So if I turn it towards the light over there, it doesn't care in any way. And if I turn it away, it doesn't care in any way. But if I take my tree, which is right behind me, it will actually kind of grow towards the light and so forth. So there is some awareness there, you know, and that's all I would say is any living thing has awareness, right? It has a sense of its own homeostasis. It has desirable and undesirable stimuli, and there are neurochemicals and so forth associated with its euphoric and dysphoric states. You know, it's not totally neutral in that regard.
Yeah, when I say that the plant isn't conscious or aware, what I'm concerned with is, does it feel like something to be the plant? And my response is no. Pure criteria for something being conscious or self-aware is being able to transmit information or receive information, then my fax machine or my printer would also happen to be conscious. Or if you want to say that that's corrupted by human consciousness because conscious agents designed it, a printer that, by quantum determinacy popped into existence on some planet, Mars, is not conscious because it's able to receive and give out information. Things moving towards sunlight. I mean, human beings can design mechanical systems which are self-sustaining, which respond to the environment in a way that it makes them likely to fulfill some purpose, like solar panels. We can design solar panels that turn towards the sun and that shape themselves in a way that is appropriate for the climate or temperature they're in. Dynamic mechanisms, and it's easily conceivable, logically conceivable, that such an entity pop into existence on a planet without cause. I don't think that's a good example of a conscious thing. It's responsive, it's dynamic, it's moving, it receives and maybe even sends information, but that's not the same thing as there being something, there being a phenomenological experience. It feeling like something to be the plant, or it feeling like something to be the printer or the fax machine or the solar panel. So my own opinion is that you're assigning the term self-awareness or consciousness too liberally, but I may be wrong.
So just to be clear, and I think I do understand, but you believe then, okay, so let's take a plant, so we'll say an evergreen tree. So you feel that an evergreen tree has no experience of being itself whatsoever? Like it has no content, it's like a table or a chair?
No, absolutely. No. There is no, in other words, it doesn't feel like anything to be the tree or any part of the tree. Absolutely not.
Okay. So I just want to say, hold on, sorry, but I understand what you're saying, but I totally disagree, and I would bet my life, well, I wouldn't bet my life on anything, right? I'm not a gambling man, but I strongly believe that plants have an experience of being themselves and are not without such an experience. It would be very, very different from ours, and perhaps quantitatively or qualitatively so far below it as to be like, we might dismiss it and say, well, that's not even close to being a person. But I promise you, it's not the same to be a tree as to be a chair.
Well, I'm not sure why the gradient of consciousness matters, because it seems like you're saying that if it feels like something to be a plant, then I can make a plant in some way feel pain, or I can make a plant suffer, right?
For sure you can, yeah. I believe science has shown that plants can suffer in a sense we would understand.
I'd have to disagree, and I disagree for the following reason. So let's quickly discuss the epistemology of consciousness, or how do we weigh whether something is consciousness? We don't go into it saying, we don't go into it assuming that something is conscious and then asking what are our reasons for thinking that it isn't conscious. Because that would be silly. That would be assigning consciousness. That would be assigning a property to everything until proven otherwise. We look at things that are obviously conscious and we track the similarities between them that ground their consciousness. So when I look at the stuff that is obviously conscious, like human beings and higher apes and certain other animals, there are certain cognitive structures. There's these things called brains that are usually at the top of the body, and they're very complicated, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And there's certain structures which seem to manifest an emotive life, a conscious life, a self-awareness. And out of this structure, this beautiful self-awareness and consciousness emerges. Okay. It seems to me that you are basing consciousness around elusive criteria. You're saying that anything which moves or anything which responds to the environment in a certain way or sends or receives signals is conscious. But I can provide you plenty of examples of stuff that moves and is dynamic and receives and sends signals that isn't conscious. It would mean that your criteria for what things are conscious is too loose because it includes things that are obviously not. If my printer is not conscious, there's my fax machine. And unless you're willing to give me an argument that organic entities specifically are conscious, so it's organic entities which move and change that are conscious, which I don't know why would it matter what the matter is? I take it that a silicon being could be conscious in the same way that an organic being could be conscious. Then I don't think you have a good argument here.
Well, that's actually really interesting. I'm sorry to hog the mic, but so I'm going to just explain my point of view, right? And I could be right and I could be wrong, of course. I respect your point of view. But I believe that anything organic, any organism that is organic, is inherently conscious. It has self-awareness, and it has inherent moral value. As of now, there has never been anything organic that is conscious, that is self-aware, or that has any actual substantive moral value. Now, I do believe that in the future, we will create artificial intelligence and silicon-type life forms that are conscious, self-aware, and have moral value. But as far as I know, we haven't done it yet. If we have, it's top secret and classified. But, toasters, printers, computers, they're not conscious, they're not self-aware, they have no inherent moral value. If you shoot a computer, you did not commit a murder. I would argue if you step on an ant, you committed not a murder, because that's a term we use to describe killing a human, but you actually have committed a morally significant action in the negative sense, right? So if I step on an ant consciously, I see an ant and I go, haha, I'm going to squish you. And I step on that ant, I believe that ant suffers. I believe it feels the pain of being crushed. And I believe that it was morally wrong to do so. If I rip a magic card in half or break a beer bottle on the ground, it doesn't suffer, it doesn't feel anything, and I haven't done anything substantially morally wrong. Now, I could be wrong, but I do not equate animals and plants to computers and printers. And I don't equate computers and printers to trees and cats. Like, so far, the potential of silicon and artificial intelligence to create morally significant self-aware creatures has not yet manifested. It probably, in my opinion, inevitably will. And we might eventually create a computer more morally significant than a person. But so far, they have no moral significance. And at the same time, even swatting a mosquito has some moral significance, because I believe that mosquito, as it's crushed and dying, is kind of like, this kind of sucks, and then it dies. Just even if it's only like 1 out of 100 that it's like, I don't like being crushed. It's not just an object. It's a thing. It's a being.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a slight contradiction lying in wait here, and maybe I'm wrong. I probably am. I need to think more about this, but this is what seems true to me. You seem to be saying that you don't call the fax or the printer conscious, but you call the plant or the fly conscious. Yet the only criteria which differentiates them of those that you listed is that one is organic and the other isn't. Then you go on to say that silicon-based beings could be conscious, which I assume means that something being organic, it is not necessary that something be organic for it to be conscious. We have a property here, something is organic, then magically produces consciousness in certain things, not allowing other things which have the same criteria minus the organic criteria from having consciousness. But it's not necessary for consciousness, it's just sufficient for consciousness. So to reiterate my point, you have identified some property which is sufficient for consciousness, but which isn't necessary for consciousness. I think crazy.
I think he's trying to say that he's trying to judge suffering as the baseline, like judge for what's conscious or unconscious if something feels suffering. So something artificial so far now can't suffer as far as we know.
Yeah, actually, kind of that is accurate. So what I think is morally significant is that which has moral value because it has what I would call an internal subjectivity. So an internal subjectivity is, having your own personal internal experience of what you find positive and negative, what you find pleasant and unpleasant, right? So all of us here have some internal experience corresponding to our lives, right? You are sitting somewhere at a computer or a phone. I'm sitting here with my phone. I am actually having an experience, and so are you. And it's the fact that you're having an experience that makes you morally important. Because if I come up and slap you in the face, you'll be like, I didn't like that. I didn't like that, right? And the fact that you didn't like it is what makes it wrong. But if I go up to my sex doll that I do not have and slapped it in the face, it wouldn't be morally wrong because it didn't feel it, you know? And I believe that when I crush even a cockroach, that cockroach does feel it. It does. Like signals go from its body to its brain, and it goes, undesirable stimulus, negative for emotional or evolutionary survival. Escape this, don't get away from this. So it has some kind of feeling equivalent to what we would call fear or pain, right? If I come into your house with a clown mask and a knife, you feel fear, and fear sucks. You don't really like to feel fear. And if I burn you with a lighter, you feel pain, and pain is not really desirable either. And when I crush a cockroach, even though its internal subjectivity is so ridiculously much lower than mine, it's still a value above zero. Whereas even the most sophisticated computer, if I shoot it with a shotgun, its family doesn't cry, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't, suffer at all. So in a sense, I've done nothing wrong. Property rights are like laughably less important usually than, this kind of thing. So I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but I would just say if I pluck a blade of grass, it gets like a signal and it goes, oh shit, something plucked us. And then it releases some kind of hormone and some kind of thing says grow or don't grow. And that means, to me, it does mean, like, I know what you're getting at. It's like a computer program. But maybe it's almost a religious belief. The organic is not just code, like it's feeling code, it's soul code.
And I'm not one to challenge any sort of like religious held beliefs. If this is something that you just is part of your worldview that you just want to hold on to, then I'm fine with that. Here's basically a brief point. I can build a fax machine such that when I destroy it, when it stops functioning, there's a dead man switch. So as it is dying, so to speak, as it's being severed, it sends one last signal that it is stopped functioning. We, in fact, have constructed computers to do this. Connection has been lost. That's it. That thing is not there anymore. So either you're imbuing these creatures with a teleology, some sort of purposiveness, which just doesn't exist in nature. Nature is, as I mentioned before, statistical, and it is brute, and it is death-based. There really isn't as much to it as we thought there was a few centuries back. Or you are unfairly applying criteria. I think you are saying, listen, the fly is conscious because of XYZ, and the the faxing machine or the printer also have XYZ, but you're just choosing not to apply criteria evenly. Or you're identifying that something is organic, and you're saying that something is organic is sufficient for it to be conscious, but it's not necessary because it's possible to have silicon-based entities that are conscious. And I mean, at this point, I think you have to bite the bullet on something, and I don't know which one you want to bite the bullet on, but I'd rather not. That's my own view.
Sure. I'm not, sorry, Techno, I'll give it to you. I'm not arguing because I, have an adversarial disagreement here, but it's just my personal feeling is actually that even a single cell is imbued with some degree of feeling and some degree of consciousness. And when we talk about emergent properties of these things, you put a whole bunch of cells together, they form an organ, and a whole bunch of organs together, tissue, and then after tissue, an organ system. So there's higher and higher levels of the emergent properties of like feeling, consciousness, suffering, etc. And so what we are as human beings is like a very, very high, well, actually the highest known order of emergent properties. So we have the property of consciousness, not because it only came into existence with humans, but because we are the highest known aggregation of the property of consciousness that actually exists even in a single cell. So every single cell, right? If you give a cell a value of 1, and you put 100 cells together and you get a tissue, and you get 100 tissues together, you get an organ. It goes value 1, value 10, value 100. And when you get all the way up to the human, it is the value of like 1,000,000. But it's only a value of 1,000,000 because it wasn't 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0. It was 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, which means that even the most basic unit of biological life, which would be a cell, has a moral value. And it has a moral value because it has a consciousness value and a feeling value. So one cell is actually capable of existing and navigating outside of a human body in an environment it can live in. So that cell is like a person, but it's like a tiny little fractional person. That would be my argument, is that even one cell has a moral value of one, and something like a human has a value of a trillion because it's a trillion cells.
Well, I guess my view is that a newly dead body is not in any way conscious. My heart alone is not in any way conscious. My left or my right toes are not in any way conscious. In my view of the emergence of consciousness isn't a bunch of things that are conscious in a lesser way adding up to greater consciousness. My view of consciousness is certain structures form via non-conscious things. There's a metaphysical law that says when you have these structures, consciousness emerges, and then consciousness emerges. Very similar to color. It's not that the individual parts of a red chair are in some way it's not that the molecules of a chair are somehow carry redness with them individually. What happens is that they produce a certain structure of reflecting light, and they uniformly reflect the property of redness. So to me, the property of consciousness is not divisible. I view it as indivisible and unitary, not reducible to smaller parts. But that is my own view. I may be wrong. I plan to do a lot of philosophy of mind in the next few months, and we'll probably have a podcast about this, discussing this more fully, if that's right with you.
Of course. That was fantastic and very interesting, very enjoyable. And I think it's feels like a good time to start wrapping it up. But if anyone has a question or comment, I think Techno Shaman has been trying to speak. Why don't you?
I have to agree with Shogun's outlook, especially when it comes to the plant world. Just through my investigations of it, plants have a kind of consciousness that's different than ours, but still sophisticated. And the proof of that comes from the fungal network that exists underneath mature forests, where they'll share nutrients with the mother tree will share nutrients with the baby trees around them, and different species will communicate, sort of like a tree internet. And so in the summer, the birch will share nutrients with the fir, and in the winter, the fir will share nutrients with the birch. And they work in a cooperative fashion that creates these emergent properties that extend even beyond a singular species. And we may be reaching a tipping point with silicon where it's getting the internet as a whole might be considered an emergent consciousness, but that's more speculative. But when as far as the plant world is concerned, I find it to be very conscious.
I think that what I'm gleaning from you talking is, so even entertaining the possibility that a bunch of internet users acting in unison allows a consciousness to emerge. I think we are being too liberal about what sort of structures can produce consciousness. I take it that there's a certain amount of spatial proximity and interconnectedness that's necessary in a very specific structure that is necessary for consciousness to emerge. What I'm seeing here is that we are pointing out really complicated phenomena in nature and saying this is really complicated, therefore it is conscious. I don't think that a really complicated watch, if it has enough parts, could be conscious. Consciousness isn't only about complexity. It isn't only about a dynamism or movement. It is about specific structures being instantiated and very specific entities emerging out of those structures. So I think we're either being very,
To use
with
the
the word
watch
consciousness.
example, I think you get to the episode of Star Trek where they're determining whether Data has personhood. And I think you could make a complicated enough watch if you made a Data.
Yeah.
You think you can make a complicated enough watch for the watch to be conscious, where the watch is not nothing like a human brain?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to get off the boat there. But, I'll have to do more reading on this to respond fully.
Well, it's a whole nother topic. Sorry, another is not a word. It is another topic. Artificial intelligence, can a artificial object or a silicone object truly be consciousness, truly be self-aware. And this has been a really good podcast, really fascinating content, and really good discussion. I think there's a lot more to be said on these topics, but I feel like it's probably an appropriate time to begin wrapping it up. What do you think, Jigmo?
I think it's an excellent time to wrap it up. I hope I did sober some justice. I covered some arguments. I hope it made sense to you guys. We touched on so many things at the end there. You know, you had moral realism pop up again. You had, the structure and origin of consciousness. You had, worries about how we evaluate things, extrinsic versus intrinsic value. There is a whole sea of things to explore here beyond this. I'm really glad we're doing it. Thank you for the opportunity once again.
And I don't mind saying that you coming into the server some time ago and running a whole series of events on philosophy and so forth has given us a wonderful opportunity to kind of dive down some of these intellectual rabbit holes in a more concentrated way. And I appreciate that. So thank you, Jigmo, very much for your time. This is indeed the 5th episode, so make sure you check out all 5 episodes of Philosophy with Jigmo on the podcast series channel of the Roundtable server. And we will resolve this now. So thank you, Jigmo. Thank you, Sago, for recording. Thank you, Tech, for recording. And make sure you join us on the Roundtable YouTube and BitChute for our 200 plus RT podcast episodes. Join the Roundtable Discord server, where this all takes place at 8 p.m. Central every day. Thank you, Jigmo. Good night, everybody.